We are ready for Psalm 83 through Psalm 86 in our survey through the Old Testament. And as we have mentioned each time, we're in the third book of Psalms, which, as per this outline before you, labels it as dealing with the sanctuary. That doesn't mean every psalm has the same relationship to the topic that every other psalm in that section does. But it does, many of them do, I should word that, have a relationship to the sanctuary. And we'll see more about that in Psalm 84 particularly. We'll see something about that particularly in Psalm 84, more so than the other psalms that we'll be studying tonight. So let's get underway, and as per your handout, let's talk about what type of psalm this is. Psalm 83, 18 verses. What type of psalm is this? I'm sorry?
A plea.
It's a plea. All right, good. Anything else? A battle cry, okay. Would you label it as an imprecatory psalm? Where there is a cry against the enemy, and it would be classified as that. So it is a plea. It has to do with, some have labeled it maybe as a lament or a complaint, but it does have this imprecatory nature as we have mentioned in other psalms. So, who is the author? Asaph. The message or the subject of this psalm. All right. Yeah, it is a plea for God to destroy some of the enemies or to defeat the enemies. I call it simply here, and sometimes these are my own titles. Sometimes I'm borrowing from Haley. Sometimes I borrow from Scraggy. Sometimes from Loophole. Sometimes from Jensen. Depends on who I like at the moment. Anyway, cry against the enemy is what I've called it here. And here's what we have in this psalm. There are four things in this psalm. There is the prayer that God not be inactive. In other words, God act on our behalf. We'll come back to that concept in a moment, verses 1 to 4. There's the plot that is against God, verses 5 to 8, and overthrow the enemy as in time past. Deals with some historical events, verses 9 through 12, and then the plea for the enemy's defeat, 13 to 18. Now, Loophole gives a two-point outline, and he calls this a dangerous emergency, verses 1 to 8, and then he calls the rest of it a prayer for just retribution on the assailants. I like that as well. But I'm going to work from the four-point outline as we work through. So this is a cry against the enemy. The occasion is not known for sure. There's nothing in the title given in the text, nor is there anything specific in the psalm that identifies it beyond a shadow of a doubt concerning the occasion. Several commentators speculate that it may have reference to the time of Jehoshaphat. And they would cite 2 Chronicles 20. We're not going to take the time to go there. If you want to turn over there and see what 2 Chronicles 20 is about, you may have some marginal notes or some headlines that your translators have put in, and you can kind of get a gist of 2 Chronicles 20. And so, excuse me, I'm going to leave that in the realm of perhaps, maybe so. I can't argue against that, but I don't have enough information to say for sure that's the case. So what evidence is it that could be cited that this is perhaps the occasion of 2 Chronicles 20? Well, it would be in verses 5 to 8 of Israel being encircled by enemies. And there's a question, is this all at one time? Or is this for poetic purposes, saying that we are surrounded by our enemies, and they're named, and we'll get to those in a moment, to the east and to the west and north and south, they're all around. We're encircled by our enemies. Is it more for emphasis that at one time or another we have been encircled by these enemies? Over here at one time and over here, that's another question. We'll get to that in a moment. So I'll leave it in the realm of perhaps. It is the occasion of Jehoshaphat, and beyond that I can't go any further. So let's talk about God being inactive. We've talked about this in several Psalms. It's as if God is not acting. The Psalm, not just this Psalm, but this happens throughout the Psalms, where do not be inactive or as if we're trying to wake God out of sleep. And I don't know that the psalmist is saying God doesn't care. So what's the point? How would you explain that to your friend who doesn't have a clue and hadn't read any of the Psalms? What's this about God perhaps being inactive? What would you say to them about that? Absolutely. If you didn't catch what Ricky said, this is another occasion where God's timetable is not our timetable. God works on a different clock than we work. And it has to do with man's impatience, thinking God should act sooner. By God not acting sooner, that maybe God's tolerating more than he should tolerate, at least what we think he should. And so here's another example of that. So it's presented from the vantage point and from the viewpoint as if God is not acting upon it, so it's a plea for God to act.
Specific example, that would be Psalm 28.
Okay, yeah.
Verse 1. My rock, do not be deaf to me. Remain silent to me, I'll be like those going down to the pit. And then jump to verse 6. Blessed be Yahweh, for he has heard the sound of my plea.
Yeah, time and again. I mean, there are numerous Psalms. A good point. Good connection. That we see this concept that it's a plea for God to act and for God to not be inactive. So let's get verses 1 to 4. Do not be silent, O God. Do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God. Here's the problem, verse 2. Behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. Now let's stop for a moment and see what we've seen so far, and then we'll tie that with verses 3 and 4. In other words, it's a plea for God no longer to be silent, no longer stay inactive. Please act on our behalf concerning the enemy. The enemy, the text says, has made a tumult. They've made an uproar. They have attacked. Who is the enemy? We'll see that beginning at verse 5. But what I want you to see at verse 2 is, those who hate you have lifted up their head. What did you learn from that? This is in the context of the people of God being under attack. But he said, he doesn't word it, those who hate us, but those who hate you. You learn anything from that? All right, yeah. Perhaps it is their arrogance.
Jesus said, if you do it unto the least of these, my brethren, you do it unto me. People act against God's people, they're acting against God.
Yes. When you act against God's people, you're acting against God. If you hate the people of God, you hate God. If you hate God, you hate the people of God. They go hand in hand. Make sense? All right, we'll say more about that in our practical lessons in a moment. Now verses 3 and 4. They take up crafty counsel against your people. The attack is against the people of God, but they hate God, is what I wanted you to see. And they've said, come, let us cry, cut them off as from being a nation. The name of Israel may be remembered no more. So it's a complete and utter attack against Israel, trying to wipe Israel out. So God, don't be active anymore. Please act on our behalf, verses 1 to 4. Now let's get verses 5 to 8. I call this simply a plot against God. It is a plot against God, but it's a plot against the people of God. Some have called Psalm 83 the confederacy. What is a confederacy? Mentions the confederacy. They form a confederacy.
Any size amount of people uniting under a common goal.
Yeah. And so here they form this coalition. They form this group, though they be of different nations, and they may even be enemies at times of one another. They come together for a common goal. There's a practical thing to learn from that. And we'll get to that in a second. So they form a confederacy, verse 5. They've consulted together, and they're with one consent. They all agree. And so he mentions Edom, Moab, Ammon, Amalek, Philistia, Assyria, and they all help the children of Lot. And so in other words, it seems perhaps that either Moab or Edom is the leader in this, and And there are nations to the north, there's nations to the south, to the east, to the southwest. There's nations all around. In other words, they're encircled. Now, there's a question among commentators, is this talking about all at the same time, perhaps? I can't argue against that. Others have said this is more poetic license. This is not talking about the same event, but at different times. This nation fought against us. That one did at another time. This one did at another time, and this one did. And so we have these enemies all around. I don't know. I don't know that I care which it is. It's that they are under attack from multiple nations, and they've all band together. There's an old saying that says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And here are those who may be enemies of each other, but when they have a common enemy, they become friends. Does that make sense? That's happening even in our own day and time. Not only as nations, it happens among individuals. So here's this plot against God by the nations pooling together and forming a confederacy. Now, verses 9 through 12 is where we get into the historical section. And by that is simply, he calls upon God to overthrow the enemy as in time past. And he cites some examples from the period of the Judges. Very good. From the period of the Judges. And so what this is an example of God overthrowing enemy nations. And God had done this in the past when the enemy nations were forming a threat against the people of God. You overthrew them then, you overthrew them again, you overthrew them again, and you overthrew them again. And so now under this present threat, please do that again. Make sense? So confidence in the future, I'm learning, here's a practical lesson, is based upon what God's done in the past. Does that make sense? All right, let's see what happens here, beginning at verse 9. Verses 9 and 10 allude to the events, and your footnotes may share this. Your depending on who your translators were, may not share this. But verses 9 and 10 seem to focus on the events of Judges chapters 4 and 5. All right? Verses 11 and 12 seem to focus on the events of Judges 7 and 8. So what's he say? Well, I'm not going to take the time to go back to Judges 4 through 8, but he mentions, deal with them as with Midian, when the Midianites were a threat, chapter 4. As with Sisera and Jabin at the brook of Kishon, who perished at Endor, at the foot of Mount Tabor. That's not mentioned in the text, I'm just identifying the location of that, when they became his refuge on the earth. So what did we just see from verses 9 and 10? Just in a broader practical sense. Yeah, you did it before, do it again. So here was a case, just going back in their memory to the events of Judges 4 and Judges 5. There was the enemy nation, the Midianites and others that had oppressed the people of God. God overthrew them by raising up military deliverers who were called judges. And so consequently, God had overthrown the enemy. Please do that again. We're not through. We're not through. Let's get verse 11. And make the nobles of Oreb like Zeb, and all the princes of Zebah and Zalmunna. These are overthrowing the princes of the Midianites, found in chapter 7 and 8 of the book of Judges, who had said, here was their goal, let us take for ourselves the pastures of God for our possession. They intended to overtake the people of God in their land. So all I want you to see down through verse 12 is the confidence for the future is based upon what God had accomplished in the past. You overthrew the enemies before, you overthrew this enemy, you overthrew this enemy, you overthrew this enemy. Please overthrow our current enemies that have formed a confederacy. If God could be successful in Judges 4, 5, 7, and 8, he can be successful here in this battle. Make sense? All right, let's fast forward now. We're not through at the psalm, and let's jump on to practical things. If God could overpower them in the days of the Judges and overpower enemies in the day of Psalms 86, 2 Chronicles 20, if our understanding be correct, finish my sentence. God can. He can do anything now. Whatever enemies, if it's an enemy nation, if it's an enemy against the church, if it's an enemy against me, God can overpower them. Make sense? All right. Let's move on. Let's finish the psalm. Verses 13 to 18, here's a plea for the enemy's defeat. Now, this gets interesting because right here we see something of the goal of that. Now, this is where we get into the imprecatory section. Already he's asking them to overthrow, but notice, make them like the whirling dust. It's interesting, Leupold talks about this more than some of the others that I consult, and I don't always know who he's talking about, but he talks about the commentators that are critical of the author of the text, meaning they're critical of God, basically. That this seems to be quite harsh, and maybe this verse is not this may be not a good psalm, because this is quite harsh for the psalmist to say, to make them like the whirling dust and like the chaff before the wind. And as the fire that burns the woods and the flame that sets the mountains on fire, and pursue them with your tempest and frighten them with your storm. Sounds harsh, doesn't it? How would you respond to the criticism? This is a harsh statement of the psalmist. And if God's inspiring him, it's a harsh statement that God's uttering.
All them things talking about God consuming, all them things consume a army or a nation, tossed to and fro, burn up, tore apart, and spread apart. It's utterly destroyed.
All right? God can and has done that. We go back to the day of the flood. God destroyed those who were the enemies of God. The Egyptians were drowned in the sea. So it's not a question, can or has God done that?
They're destroying God's people, so he's going to destroy them.
Yeah. We're not talking about destroying innocent people as much as it's dealing with bringing down a nation that's attacking the people of God. Remember back at verse 2, verse 2, they hate you, God. These are the people that hate God. It's a call for justice, and that's all through the Psalms. Now, there are two things I want you to see here in this section of 13 to 18. And that is what's going to be accomplished. Let me skip verse 16. That's one of the verses I want to come to. Verse 17, let them be confounded and dismayed forever, and let them be put to shame and perish. This is truly an imprecatory psalm, praying for the defeat of the enemy. May they be brought down to their knees. May they be defeated. Now, there are two things that will be accomplished when that happens. And so let's see what they are. Verse 16 is the first. Yeah, fill their faces with shame. I'm reading the New King James. That they may seek your name, O Lord. Defeat the nations, that they may come to know who you are, and they may have shame for their sin. So yes, this is an imprecatory psalm. Defeat the enemies, bring them down, as long as they hate you. But I hope in doing so, that they come to know who you are, and they may have shame. All right, watch the second thing. Verse 18. Yeah, that God is still in control, that they may know that you, whose name alone is the Lord, are the Most High who rules over the earth. And so by you defeating the enemies, so you think of Israel being encircled by the enemies. If this is all at one time, and they have formed this confederacy where all at one moment they're attacking, and God defeats all of that confederacy. He said, I hope they come to shame so that they begin to what was the wording of verse 16? They may seek your name, and that people may know that you alone are the God who rules over the earth. Powerful, powerful goals. Questions or comments now on Psalm 83? Practical things you learned from Psalm 83. You take home with you and you say, this is good stuff right here. Let's start where we just finished. God rules in the kingdoms of men. Did you learn that? What else did you learn? Psalm 83. Good point. Good point. Very good point. He's not just interested, I want to destroy people because I don't like them. That's not what he's doing. Good point. What else? Take home with you. Psalm 83. God has always had, and his people have always had, enemies. If you are a person of God and you're with a group of the people of God, you can mark it down somewhere there's enemies that are fighting against you. If they're not, maybe we're not fighting enough against them, against those who are against God. All right, what else? Let's get one or two more and we're going to go. Practical things you take home with you.
Well, it's okay to want something to happen to them to where they would seek.
Yeah. We hope they be defeated, but we hope they come to know the Lord. Hope they come to know the Lord. All right. And if we learn anything from this psalm, those who have a common enemy will band together. And so you find that often. Somebody standing for the truth, those who don't like something about him, someone who's their enemy will band together with them to fight against them. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. All right, let's go to Psalm 84. What type of psalm do we have? All right. It does involve praise. What else? It could be classified as a psalm dealing with praise because particularly when we get to the end, there is this wanting to be in the sanctuary of God. Say again. Yes, very good. Nick? Confidence, yes. There seems to be a degree of complaint. As we've mentioned repeatedly, you can classify Psalms in more than one category. Sometimes it may be imprecatory and at the same time have some praise. It may have a complaint and at the same time have praise. So let's look at what would you say the subject matter is? Psalm 84, topic, message. Say again. God's greatness and mercy. All right. Yes, my desire for God and my longing for God. Look at verse 2. Let's get ahead of ourselves. My soul longs, yes, even faints for the courts of the Lord. Longing for the house of God. Now, this is quite an interesting psalm to me. And I think you'll find it interesting if you hadn't already read it. There's the longing for the house of God, verses 1 to 4. There's the blessing for those who trust in the God of the house. And if I had more room, I would put on out there for those who trust in the God of the house of God. And then there's a strange verse here. By that, it is seemingly out of the blue. And if you took it out, the context flows. So it's kind of a parenthesis section of prayer for the king. Some think that's messianic. I'm not convinced it is. And then why I'd rather be in the house of God. So let's work through this. Short psalm, powerful psalm. So what is the occasion? We don't really know much about the occasion. Some have called this a pilgrimage because of the word that's used at verse 5. And we'll come back to that. It seems, though, to me that this psalm, like Psalm 42, is the psalmist is temporarily banished from the house of God. For what reason? I don't know. But for some reason, he's not able to be at the house of God. And so he longs to be there. And so not being there, he longs and he misses that. And so he wants to go. So let's work through this. Verses 1 to 4, he's longing for the house of God. How lovely is your tabernacle. He describes the house of God as a lovely place. My soul longs and faints for the courts of God. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. So I'm crying out for God and crying out to be with God in the courts. Now the next two verses I think are merely an illustration. Some have thought this to be an allegory and they try to make the bird represent something and the offspring of the bird represent something. I don't think so. At least that doesn't make sense to me. I think what he's saying that even the sparrow has found a home and the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young, even your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. What's he talking about? Well, some suggest that the sparrow has a place, they can go where they want to, and the swallow can go where she wants and lay her eggs wherever she wants, and yet I'm not able to go to the house of God. And so some think that's what he's talking about. Maybe so. Others have suggested that perhaps he's talking that just as the bird could go without hindrance. The bird can fly out to the temple or the tabernacle area. They can go to the house of God, and I long to have that freedom to go. It's something along that line I think is being emphasized in verse 3 and 4. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. The bird feels at home there, and he can go there freely. And I want to be there, and I long to be there at my home and be at home at the house of God. It's just a longing for the house of God. Now, at verse 5 through 8, I think he turns to talk about the blessings for those who trust in the God of the house of God. We've talked about the house of God. What about the God of the house? So notice he starts with this word, blessed is the man whose strength is in you. So there's a multiplicity of blessings that come upon the one. So let's divide that into 3 sections. I'm convinced verse 5 is talking about the one who has their wholehearted trust and they are wholeheartedly following God, that their strength is the Lord. Luther so translates that at verse 5. So let's go back and look at verse 5 again. Blessed is the one whose strength is in you, whose heart is set on pilgrimage. Now, your translation may say the way. The word pilgrimage just simply means way or the road. They've got their heart set toward God. They're on the road toward God. They're on the road of God. I don't know that it's talking about this is a psalm for making their way to the house of God. It may. I don't know that there's evidence of that. But their strength is the Lord. If they're wholeheartedly following Him. That's the idea, I think, of the latter part, whose heart is set on pilgrim. Their heart's set on the way. All right? Now verse 6. I had to read verse 6 several times to get the point, and I think I'm right about this. As they pass through the valley of Baca, or weeping, or parchment, your translation may say, they make it a spring, and rain as also covers it with pools. So it's like those who are wholly dedicated to God, they have an impact on others. They're like going through a parched ground and they bring rain, not literally. But it's talking about their impact upon others. Does that make sense? Those who wholeheartedly follow God have an impact upon others as they make their way through. All right? That's part of the blessing. You can be a blessing to other people. Now, verse 7, they go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before God in Zion. In other words, that idea of strength to strength is continuing to grow. I mean, this is a powerful psalm. This would make a good sermon, wouldn't it, Nick? That we long for the house of God. Here's the blessings of those who trust in God. Their strength is in the Lord. If they're wholeheartedly dedicated to God, they have an impact upon others, and they continue to grow. Now, here's the strange verse. I'm not being critical of the psalmist. I'm just saying it just seems like it's almost out of place. I'm not saying it's out of place. Oh God, behold our shield, and look on the face of your anointed. That would be the king. A statement about the Messiah here, I don't think is fits as much as a prayer for the king. Perhaps because of being banished, that be with our king, and that has something to do with being able to go back to the house of God. That's the best I can do with verse 9. Now let's go back to verses 10 through 12. It's almost as if that was this interlude at verse 9, and verse 10 picks up, and the for, a day in your courts, refers back to verse 7. And that is, having, before he concluded the previous section and then this interlude, now this is why I'd rather be at the house of God. So let's see what he says. Verse 10 makes us a statement, and then verse 11 and 12 tell me why that statement is true. What is the statement? Actually makes two statements. A day in your courts, yeah, better than 1,000 elsewhere. The word elsewhere is not found in the text. It may be in your translation. It's been supplied, but that's it is not only supplied, but it's implied. So, here's the idea that one day in the courts of God is better than 1,000 days somewhere else. And so he misses that. He wants to be back at the house of God. Secondly, he said, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. We said, well, that's obvious. I think the tents of wickedness stand for living a life of comfort. So it's not just, okay, the tents of wickedness, you'd think, who wants to go to the tents of wickedness? That's a life of comfort versus being a doorman at the house of God. You got your own place to live, and it's comfortable, and would you rather live in all the comfort or be a doorman in the house of God? One commentator observed that verse 4, he said, I'd rather just be near the house of God than live in the tents of wickedness. I'd rather just be at the door of the house of God than to live in this tent over here. Make sense? Or I'd rather be at the door of the house of God than to be in this mansion over here. Now, why is that true? He said, I'd rather be at the house of God. Why? Verse 11.
He's our shield and gives glory. And grace.
Yes. For the Lord is a sun and a shield, and he will give grace and glory, and no good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly. In other words, he richly, richly, richly blesses those who, verse 5, wholeheartedly follow him. That's why I'd rather be there. Makes sense? He's longing for the house of God. One writer raised the question about Psalm 84, do you feel at home in the house of God? The psalmist said, I'd rather just spend one day there than 1,000 somewhere else. All right, practical things you learn from Psalm 84. What do you learn? Take home with you. All right, God richly blesses us. What else? Psalm 84.
His attitude about being a doorkeeper that dwell in the tents of evil, it's easy for people to look for an evil day out. We're better off blessed.
Very good, very good. This idea of perhaps the tents leave an impression that this was written in a day where living in tents was what everybody did. They not live in a mansion, they live in tents. And so it may leave an impression, I'd rather be a doorkeeper than to dwell in the tents. Who would want to dwell in a tent anyway? I think he's talking about a picture again of comfort, of joy, pleasure. I'd rather be a doorkeeper and only be at the door of the house of God. It's the same principle of a day in the courts rather than 1,000 is the idea. Yes, sir.
Often, whenever there's the idea of the temple or the house or the tabernacle or tent, often gets back to the fellowship that we have with God. It comes with it. It comes from a relationship we have with Him. The happiness that's here is always connected with doing something positively with God. So happy are those whose strength is in you. Happy are those who reside in your house, who praise you continually. Happiness is not found in self, but found in that relationship and fellowship that one has with God.
Good point. Good point. All right, let's move on to Psalm 85. What type of psalm is this? It's a prayer. Jensen calls this a patriot's prayer. Message. This is obviously by the author. I missed the author there. Is the Sons of Korah. The message or subject matter. Yeah, it's a prayer for restoration. And this is seemingly a time of national distress. some form of national distress. Some put this in the time period of the return, the remnant. Others argue that it couldn't be. The argument that it couldn't be is that there seems to be some joy in coming back, and if you read Nehemiah and Ezra, there wasn't real joy. I don't see that. I missed that point somewhere. Was there some problems? Yeah, but there was joy in coming back to the land. But be that as it may, I'll leave that. You can check Loophole for some of those references. So let's look at this psalm. Psalm 85. Three things happen here. There's the grateful acknowledgement. That is, they're coming, if the timing be correct. There is some return of coming back already. And then there's this earnest appeal, and then there's the conditioned assurance. This is typical of the Psalms, of referring to the past, using that as a basis for the future, and making an appeal for the present. So let's look at verses 1 to 3, this grateful acknowledgement. That you have been favorable to your land, you brought back the captivity of Jacob. So somebody has come back, and if what I suggested earlier be correct, this is probably coming back from Babylonian captivity. You have forgiven the iniquity of your people, you've covered their sins, you've taken away your wrath and turned your fierce from. I can't read. You have turned from the fierceness of your anger, and so starting at verse 4 now, based on this grateful acknowledgement for what you have done for us thus far in bringing us out of captivity. And we know that's true whether my understanding of the date be correct. There's some form of captivity they have come out of. So notice the plea for restoration. Here's the earnest appeal for restoration. You might underline some of these expressions that I think in this psalm are synonymous, though I don't mean these phrases are completely synonymous in every respect. But, for example, verse 4, restore us. Here's a plea for restoration. In other words, take us back to what we should be. Cause your anger toward us to cease. Look at verse 6. Revive us. Verse 7, show us your mercy. So, and there may be another expression or two. All of those are synonymous for the idea of restoration. We've come back into the land. You've let your anger be subsided so that we're allowed to come back into the land. And so this is a period of restoration. That's what Ezra, Nehemiah, and those post-exile prophets were doing, is trying to restore. It's a period of restoration. Now then, let's talk about this conditioned assurance. And I know I'm hurrying a little bit through this psalm. I'm trying to get to Psalm 86. I want us to see some things in that psalm. What do you see in verses 8 to 13? Does the psalmist think God's going to listen? Yes. I will hear what God, the Lord, will speak, because he's convinced he's going to speak peace, verse 8. Surely, verse 9, I'm skipping some words. Surely his salvation is near to those who fear him. In other words, I'm speaking as if I'm the psalmist. I am confident God's going to hear. He's going to give us peace. He's going to bless those that fear him. We do fear him. By the way, Nehemiah 1 talks about those who desire to fear your name. It was used throughout the book of Nehemiah. What else do you see down through verse 12? Verse 12, yeah, what is good? And our land will yield its increase. Righteousness will, now this is interesting, verse 13. Righteousness will go before him, and he shall make his footsteps our pathway. He goes before us. His footsteps are our pathway. I like what Scroggie said. He said, this is the royal road to travel. See that its golden dust is on your feet. I like that. This is the golden road to travel. Make sure its golden dust are on your feet. Now, what he's done is go from, this is not original with me, he's gone from recollection, verses 1 to 3, to supplication, 4 to 7, to anticipation, 8 to 13. I remember what you did. I'm pleading with you now, And I'm assured you're going to answer that prayer. That ought to be our attitude in prayer. God, you've answered and blessed us in the past. Bless us now. I am confident you're going to do it again. I believe you will. On what basis? You've done it in the past. Make sense? Let's get a couple of practical lessons from Psalm 80. What was that? 85. That's 85. I started to say 84. 85. Before we leave.
The request to turn around and bless the people is not based upon them, because he freely acknowledges their guilt, their sin, but it was based upon God's graciousness, his loving kindness, his faithfulness. He had forgiven people in their sin in the past, and because of that, there was confidence that they would be forgiven.
Good point. Sometimes we think maybe God won't answer my prayer because I may not be good enough. That wasn't the basis. It was on the basis of you've answered in the past. Your goodness is what makes us do that. Think that. Anything else? Psalm 85. Let's go to Psalm 86 because we want to talk about some things in Psalm 86. In the interest of time, this is a prayer. It is a psalm of David. The only one that is identified as being a psalm of David in the third book, for what that may be worth to us. Now, what is this psalm about? This is a plea for mercy based on God's greatness. And so let's see what this psalm says. And we've got just a few minutes, so let's see if we can make it through this psalm. I want you to notice this pattern that I've put out to the side. In all four sections, he talks about God's goodness, His greatness, His grace, and His gifts. It won't take us long to work through this psalm. The reason is we don't have very long. But anyway, he goes through this pattern of a plea and then the reason for that plea. So let's work through that, see if we can see that. Here's the plea. He said, verse 1, hear me. I'm going to have to skip some words. Preserve my life, verse 2. Save your servant, verse 2. Be merciful and rejoice the soul. Here's the plea. Bless me, in other words. On what basis? What reason now? Look at verse 5. For you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive, abundant in mercy. You're good. So the first section is based upon God's goodness. All right, let's start at verse 6. Here's the plea. The plea is, give ear, verse 6, attend to my voice. In the day of my trouble, I call on you, and you will answer. There's the plea. Listen and answer my plea. The reason, drop down to verse 10, for you are great. So it's based on God's greatness. Here's the plea, bless me, based on His goodness, based on His greatness. Start at verse 11. Verse 11, here's the plea. This is interesting. Teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear you. That unite my heart is an undivided heart. Undivided loyalty. And the plea is that I will praise you. If you do that, then I will praise you with all my heart. So teach me and help me to have this undivided a heart of devotion to you. Based upon what? Look at verse 13. For great is your mercy. Look at verse 15. You're full of compassion and gracious. So it's based on God's grace. Now let's get the last two verses. Here's the plea, verse 16. Give your strength to your servant. Have mercy on me. I'll reverse those, but same point. And then the reason, because you have helped me. In other words, give to me mercy. Why do I ask for that? Because you have helped. You've given to me before. So here's this pattern of a plea, and here's the reason. Bless me because you're good. Bless me because you're great. Bless me because you're gracious. Bless me because you give gifts. Make sense? Plea for mercy based upon God's goodness. Practical lessons. We got time for one or two, then we're going to be done. Psalm 86. If we don't get another one, we've got to get a couple from verse 11. One is the desire to be taught. Teach me your way, O Lord. Is that really our attitude? I want to be taught your way. And secondly, an undivided heart. A united heart. What else? Anything else? Yeah, can't serve God and self. Has to be an undivided heart. Psalm 87 next time.